Good morning from Vancouver, and welcome to this celebration of the publication of Education, Civics, and Citizenship in Egypt by Ehaab Abdou. I'm Kieran Forde, the chair for today, joining you from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Along with our host, Bill Pinar, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Please note that the event is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube later today. Let me first introduce Dr. Abdou. Ehaab is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. In addition to completing a Master's of International Development from the University of Pittsburgh in 2004 and his PhD in Educational Studies from McGill University in 2019, Ehaab has also worked with international development organizations and policy institutes, including Canada's International Development Research Centre in Cairo, the Brookings Institution, and the World Bank Institute in Washington, D.C. Let me also introduce our panelists for this morning, Dr. Claudia Mitchell, professor in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education and director of the Institute for Human Development and Wellbeing at McGill University, and Dr. Paul Zanazanian, associate professor in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education, also at McGill. Dr. Zanazanian could not join us in real time today, so ahead of time, he sent a short video with his contribution, which I will share with you later in the session. A quick word about format, and then we can begin. Over the next 20 to 30 minutes, Ehaab will summarize what he has achieved here. Next, Claudia, and by video, Paul, will each pose a question for a discussion of around 10 minutes. Afterwards, if there's time left at around the 60-minute mark, I'll ask if anyone else in attendance has a question. At that point, you may unmute and pose your question, or you can post it in the chat and I'll read it aloud for you. Until then, please keep your device muted and we can get going with the overview of the book. Okay, Ehaab, over to you to introduce your work.
Thank you very much, Kieran, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for all your help in putting this together. I really appreciate it, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. It's a real honor and a real privilege to be joining all of you today, and thank you very much for your time to share some insights about this book that I feel very privileged and very honored to have been able to produce with all the support that I'll be talking about. I want to start I will start with the land acknowledgement, and then I want to share a few thank yous and my gratitude, and also maybe a little bit about why this book, what it came about, and also connecting it a little bit to my own personal journey. And maybe summarizing a few key findings and takeaways that I think might be helpful contributions to the space of curriculum studies, of which, of course, our dear Bill Pinar is one of our key gurus. And then perhaps just some brief insights about my current engagements and next steps based on some of that work. So I would like to start with acknowledging that I'm joining all of you today from Southern Ontario, from Waterloo, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and neutral peoples, and to share my gratitude for their stewardship of this land for the past many millennia, and also to acknowledge and hopefully remind ourselves to continue to be committed to efforts of truth and dialogue and reconciliation, and righting historical injustices and current marginalization. And also, before I start, I would like to say a happy and blessed Nowruz for anyone celebrating that the Persian New Year and the Baha'i special celebration of Nowruz, as well as the Lenten season, whether people have started a few weeks ago in the Western Church or in the Eastern churches, those who are currently celebrating or just started the Lent season a few days ago, and happy and blessed Ramadan to anyone observing, and of course any other special occasions that I might have missed. Sorry, and if anyone is observing any other celebration. I would like to start with a lot of gratitude because I think we've heard that a lot, but it might sound a bit cliche, the idea that we stand on the shoulders of giants, but I honestly and very deeply feel that, and I feel I've been carried through this whole process, whether through this book or maybe some of the support and the very generous kindness and support that I've been getting on next steps as well from many of those in this school, including our dear Bill Pinar. I want to start by thanking Professor Bill Pinar for his support and allowing this book to come out under this his series that he's co-editing with Palgrave Macmillan. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I'd like to thank my great and supportive doctoral supervisors, Professor Claudia Mitchell, who's with us, and of course, Dr. Paul Zanazanian, who has shared some helpful, very helpful insights, and of course, who wrote the foreword for this book as well, for which I'm extremely grateful. And of course, not with us today, the two other wonderful doctoral committee members, Dr. Khalid Medani and Khalid Fahmi, who I'm very grateful as well for their ongoing support as well. I'm also very grateful to see a few familiar faces, including, of course, my dear friends, Mona Makramallah, my comrade in the doctoral journey from McGill, as well as my great friend Hania Sobhi, who's provided some really helpful insights as well and critical feedback on earlier manuscripts. And my wonderful, last but not least, my wonderful partner, Peter Poprowski, joining us from Montreal. Why this book? Perhaps going back, sometimes I forget the beginnings, and I think this was a great opportunity for me. This invitation to talk about the book helped me a little bit reflect about why I started this this journey, and even the doctoral journey based on which the book is informed by. So growing up in Egypt, I grew up sensing a sense of rich diversity and hearing about the long multi-layered history of the country. However, growing up, especially in a Muslim household, for instance, I grew up not knowing a lot or much about Coptic history, for instance, the Egyptian Christian history, or Nubian history, for instance, and so on. I would only get bits and pieces from my neighbors, for instance, who would go to Sunday school and come back and tell me a little bit about that and so on. And then this became even more apparent through my community engagement, including the Ana Masri Musical Ensemble. As a music amateur and as a singer-songwriter, I've helped establish a couple of ensembles trying to celebrate Egyptian diversity and the richness and the multi-layered, multi-religious, multicultural, multi-ethnic nature of our very rich Egyptian society. And based on some of those conversations, it became very apparent that even those who among whether the ensemble's members or people coming to attend our concerts, despite very good intentions of respect and coexistence and so on, there was very little knowledge about the other community, the other communities' histories or contributions, and so on. So that's what prompted me to say, what is our educational system telling us and teaching us about that diversity, about the other, so that we can really appreciate and draw on some of those knowledges and contributions and so on. And hence the doctoral journey based on which this book comes in the book, as I'm going to outline now some of the key findings and so on, is based on the dissertation, but also I had the chance, because it was a few years removed from the process, I had a chance also to add several nuances and a new additional chapter, as I will highlight. The book mainly revolves around the key question of how do students' interactions with dominant historical narratives and curricular representations or misrepresentations shape their civic attitudes and intergroup dynamics. So very much connected to some of what I observed, and I wanted to really dig a bit deeper and explore. Is there a connection? If there is a connection, how can we make our curricular representations more inclusive of various perspectives, various minority narratives, various historical contributions, and so on? How the book is organized, it's organized into six key chapters. It starts off with the wonderful Forde from Dr. Paul Zanazanian. And in the first chapter, I engage a little bit with with various theories that have sought to and earlier studies that sought to engage with the question of discourse, historical narratives, and how those might shape civic attitudes. The second chapter is more of a historical overview and literature review of what's been contributed to to an understanding of the evolution of the education system. In this chapter, I draw on a lot of various scholars, including some who are with us today, such as Hania Safhi's excellent work on that. In chapter 3, I start to engage a little bit with what was starting to emerge from the field research and the study. So how young Egyptians seem to interact with the official curriculum and the classroom, its classroom enactment. And then the fourth chapter is focusing on young Egyptians' civic attitudes and engagement based on some of the questions that I posed in terms of what they are choosing to, where they're choosing to volunteer, what type of public engagement, whether current or future. In chapter 5, I'm trying to bring the two together because this seems to be an area that needs further exploration in the literature in general, in terms of trying to better connect the historical consciousness discussions and the other discussion around citizenship and civic engagement and so on. So trying to, based on what was emerging from the study, trying to perhaps present a framework and how the two might be connected, and that hopefully could be refined through other critical engagements in other contexts across the world. And finally, in chapter 6, I try to give voice to my participants and trying to present some of what they were experiencing in terms of exclusion or inclusion, and how they would aspire to see. What would they aspire to see in future curricula? And hopefully this could have some implications for curriculum developers and policymakers, whether in the Egyptian context or beyond. The theoretical approach to this study and the book in general draws on several theories, and I'll highlight those, and of course informed in general by curriculum studies and curriculum theorization, including, of course, the work of Professor Bill Pinar, who I cite, of course, a lot in shaping this whole conversation. More specifically, the two areas that I tried to explore here, as you saw in the question and I was just explaining. First is understanding dominant historical narratives. What are key discourses that help shape them, and what are dominant historical narratives? So trying to unpack that a little bit, trying to look at theories that can help us unpack that. So mostly drawing on critical theory, critical discourse analysis informed by critical theory, and critical pedagogy, trying to highlight some questions around structural and systemic injustice or marginalizations, and how those could help shed light more specifically on perhaps misrepresented or omitted perspectives, narratives, and contributions. The second pillar in study is around that other connection that was speaking about. How do those representations then shape humans' experiences of themselves? How do they shape subjectivities, civic attitudes, engagement, and actions? So drawing a lot on historical consciousness and the various contributions by various scholars, including, of course, of Paul Zanazanian, who adds a lot to that. And then trying to find ways that also bring the two together, such as the work of James Wirth on schematic narrative templates. What are the recurring themes? What is the template? What is the structure? What is the skeleton that is shaping the historical narratives, various historical narratives and events in the Egyptian case, and how might some of those more resilient pillars perhaps be approached in more inclusive, multi-perspective ways? How can we encourage teachers and students to challenge some of those, or maybe critically engage with them, as opposed to accept them as givens? And finally, the trying to connect, I think, drawing on some of the work of Banks and Westheimer and Can was very helpful in terms of trying to better understand how can we perhaps understand different types of civic engagement and actions, which, as I mentioned, I believe is one of the key contributions of this book in terms of how do we take historical consciousness forward, and how can we bring various often disparate frameworks together, historical consciousness and civic engagement and actions. Yeah. Methodological approaches, of course, I draw on a lot of various methods within qualitative research. At the center of this are some the written narrative part, but also drawing a lot on the very inspiring innovations and contributions made by our participatory visual methodologies guru, Professor Claudia Mitchell, who's with us today, and I'm very grateful as of course, my doctoral co-supervisor and commentator today as well. So my key data collection methods were a written exercise where students were asked to write in detail what their understanding of the country's history is, and then probing a few additional questions, and then asking them to draw a pre-interview drawing where they would hand draw their understanding of the country's history. I'll show you a couple of examples of that. And then followed by a semi-structured interview, and then a participatory visual methods workshop where we focused more on groups of these participants working together on presenting some of the misrepresented or omitted narratives that they would have wanted to see in their curriculum and their classroom practices. So for the remaining time, I would just want to highlight a few key findings that I up with that, and then I'm very much looking forward to the questions by Forde, Zanazanian, and Claudia Mitchell, and then a discussion. So I'll briefly highlight. So these are some examples of what some of the students drew in their in the workshops and in the pre-drawing interview, drawing on Mitchell's interact with curricular and classroom misrepresentations or misrepresentations was one of the key areas that I shed some light on in terms of two key areas. One, that misrepresenting lived experiences is a key turning point for many in their a sense of credibility vis-a-vis the curriculum. For instance, the representations of the January 2011, or what has been called after that the Arab Spring, for instance, where students were living a very different experience and then seeing their textbooks depict a very different reality, and maybe highlighting the role of particular institutions versus others, or maybe misrepresenting the narrative according to them, really was a turning point in their relationship, not only with the official curriculum, but also the whole official historical narrative. They started approaching that with much more critical approaches, even if they were not really equipped with the tools. And this is what we'll talk about more. Misrepresenting and omitting minoritized histories and contributions also helps shape experiences and civic attitudes. A lot of times minoritized students would, because of that omission, choose to work in areas such as in civic attitudes, in areas of interfaith dialogue, to try to reach out to a majority, for instance, such as the case in many of the Egyptian Christian or Coptic participants, for instance. But also it becomes a little bit problematic when unfortunately students are not equipped to engage with various types of dominant discourses. What type of discourse are they reverting to when they are critiquing the dominant narrative that might be misrepresenting their lived experiences or their community? What other narratives are they reverting to that might be equally perhaps exclusionary or radical in some cases, as we see in various parts of the world, or perhaps at least has some blind spots that they need to be aware of, perhaps. So one example reflecting on the lack of teaching about Egyptian Christian Coptic history and modern contributions. One of the participants, Caroline, in her reflection was saying, to that extent, you do not know anything about me. To that extent, I am that unknown to you, except for my name and my final grades at the end of the year. I'm actually much more than that. That was a reflection to how some of her colleagues would ask her some very basic questions about whether the Egyptian Christian history or the Christian faith, for instance. In choosing to represent what she would include in the curriculum in the future in her textbooks. And sorry that I'm using textbooks and curriculum interchangeably, because I know this is a no-no in curriculum study, but what she would want to see in her textbooks, really, she drew this. And it was very interesting because she sort of there and she presented that, and this is the miracle of the Muqattam Hill that is said to have been led by a pious Coptic monk in challenging some authorities in showing his faith. And showing that miracle happened. So in choosing to do that, she chose maybe a transcendental or a spiritual narrative, and maybe approaching it as a historically documented narrative. Similarly, Mahmoud, another a pseudonym for another participant from the south of Egypt, he's a Muslim participant, and because of the lack of representation of his perspectives in the curriculum, he started reverting to an extracurricular Muslim religious-based history discussion group. And in some of his responses, he had a very negative perspective vis-a-vis ancient Egypt. For him, this was the polytheistic pagan past that we don't even need to connect to or talk about. So ancient Egypt's ethical and moral values were characterized by significant imbalances, according to him, for instance. So in those two cases, the students were critical of the dominant narrative, but perhaps when they were invited to look at what misrepresentations or what their understanding of other perspectives, perhaps they were not able to apply the same critical approach, whether to the sources themselves or the discourse, or checking in on their positionalities as well. Another key finding, I think, that emerges from the two examples I shared of Mahmoud and Teresa is that, of course, because of that turning point of the lived experience being misrepresented in textbooks, for instance, the January 2011 uprisings, there seems what many of the students were reverting to, it seems to many of them were critical as well, but this perhaps this because of the lack of historical research tools and critical engagement with curriculum, they seem to have been confined within two key dominant discourses. We see that clearly here, for instance, with Mahmoud and Teresa, who revert to a religious-based discourse, for instance. Many of the other students who seem to have wanted to liberate themselves from the territorial nationalistic discourse as well, seem to also, even in critiquing, they were borrowing or taking for granted some of the key pillars of the Egyptian schematic narrative template, or that key recurring pattern. So this is one depiction of what I'm hoping that we need to problematize as well. And this is not only confined to the case of Egypt. We see it in many other societies that we see it. I see it very clearly in the case of Pakistan, for instance, where there's a territorial nationalistic discourse that is propagated perhaps by the ruling elite and perhaps the military, for instance, and then you have another that is that might be challenging it from a religious-based discourse. So some of the key elements, for instance, of the territorial nationalistic discourse, some of the elements that seem to have emerged as well from discussions, a diffusionist approach, which perhaps celebrates the ancient history as disproportionately significant and one way vis-a-vis other ancient civilizations, emphasizes the need for a strong, non-theocratic, stable, and centralized rule, perhaps normalizes inequitable social structures, perhaps also highlights a key role of particular institutions to continue to legitimize them, such as, for instance, the military, as in the case of Egypt or Pakistan or many other contexts. And then you have the religious-based discourses, perhaps that are propagated by religious-based ideological movements, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamist movements, and others. where perhaps the use of reference of Abrahamic scriptures, mostly Islamic, as sources of historical knowledge and curricula. You see that in history textbooks, for instance, in the case of Egypt, use of Abrahamic religious language, so not representing some of these wisdom traditions or these histories on their own terms, in their own terms, or in their own language, but by projecting and using these references. I think the issue that we need to be more aware of, and a key takeaway from this, is that there are very resilient areas where the two overlap. And this becomes, I think, the more sticking points and the more resilient points that we need to be aware of. So, for instance, the two of them are very much overlapping when it comes to valorizing particular religious traditions, such as monotheism versus other belief systems. Both, for instance, in the case of depicting ancient Egyptian for their own causes and their own reasons, vilify ancient Egyptian religious establishment and its clergy. For the territorial nationalistic, it's because of trying to vilify any theocracy. And in the case of the religious-based discourse, it's more around maybe negating other or polytheistic or pagan, perhaps, ideologies. And the two seem to also, in different ways, mix religious-based narratives with historical evidence, as we see in textbooks, for instance. Some implications on why some of this is important. One is that perhaps this helps shed some light on the need for more holistic frameworks to analyze individuals' historical conscience tendencies and how those shape their civic engagement and actions. And this is one of the things that I try to engage with in the book, trying to look at historical conscience theorizations and those relating to citizenship and civic action typologies, trying to bring the two together somehow and adding some nuances. So in the tendencies and approaches towards the master narrative in terms of historical consciousness, and then the tendencies towards civic engagement informed by Banks and other theorization that people such as my dear friend and colleague Nashwa Muhyiddin, for instance, has contributed a lot on. And in the book, I build a lot on her initial also studies in the context of Egypt as well. So one of the key contributions, I think, and implications is that we need to add further nuances. The original typology that proposed by Rosen and most other scholars, except perhaps Zanazanian a little bit and Duquette, who start to maybe challenge that or add some nuances to it, is that they are listed as four key layers: the traditional, exemplary, critical, and genetic, without enough nuances within each of those. So one of the key proposals that I'm making in the book is that within each of those, we need to highlight that there are people who could be in the traditional type, basically taking history as is and reproducing it and not challenging it, who are unreflective. But there are others who are within that who also could be reflective. And this is an addition because the assumption is that all those in the traditional or exemplary are mostly in the unreflective camp, perhaps. I saw in some of the participants that some who were very traditionalist in their perspectives were starting to at least be reflective when it came to gender roles, for instance. And I think it's important to acknowledge those, because then if we are able to see some of our students starting to exhibit some of those questions, then this could be an invitation to perhaps engage them in more critical approaches towards dominant narratives or other perspectives, maybe help them continue to ask questions around structures and systems that might be just or unjust in some cases. The other addition is that in the critical typology in most of the literature, it's taken critical. There seems to be an assumption that all those in the critical realm are reflective. But as I showed, for instance, here with Mahmoud and Teresa, they are critical of the dominant narrative. They have they're very engaged civically, and so on. But it was a clear blind spot when it came to their critical self-reflection on their own, perhaps religious identities, and perhaps the equally perhaps exclusionary perspective that they were reverting to. And maybe they were not, they didn't have enough of the tools to engage with those critically, as well as they are critically engaging with a dominant nationalistic territorialist narrative, for instance. So the idea also of we need to acknowledge that some of our students and teachers might be critical of one particular narrative, but perhaps are not as equipped because of blind spots that are introduced by their positionality and perhaps their deeply seated beliefs and ideologies that need to be further unpacked and perhaps challenged and invited to be critiqued in the classroom. Yeah. This is how some of those, and I provide some examples in the book. I won't go into that. So, and I will end by perhaps highlighting some of the recommendations on possible ways forward, because really, I would, in many ways, the book hopes to capture some of what's happening, tries to build on some of the momentum, some of the excellent work that is happening on multiple layers in the Egyptian context and, of course, in many other parts of the world, whether it's people within the Ministry of Education trying to reform things. And I have a few friends and colleagues who are working very closely doing that, very sincere, very passionate people, community-led organizations, teachers who are trying to challenge things, youth groups, of course, extracurricular groups, scholars, many of whom are with us here in the call as well, who are pushing boundaries. So maybe this could add a little bit to some of these conversations. It became apparent that from the students, when one of the questions was, what would you want to see in future textbooks and curricula towards a more balanced, more representative, and more equitable, inclusive understanding of the history, and where students would feel appreciated, valued, and so on. A few of the themes that emerged, one was around expanding space allocated to religious and ethnic minority narratives and contributions, including more modern and contemporary ones. Interestingly, this was not only highlighted by some minority students, but many who are not who might be from privileged socioeconomic backgrounds, or might be Muslim, or from urban centers and so on. There was a lot of around this theme that we need to show the history of other parts of the country, of other religious minority groups and ethnic minority groups, and so we can better appreciate. And there was an emphasis on modern and contemporary ones as opposed to ancient ones, which is good to have, but more modern and contemporary. Acknowledging multiplicity of narratives and perspectives, and this is, I think, was key and was implicit and obvious in many of the response and the coding. I was doing that. While some were able to, because of maybe taking some university level history and historical research courses, they were equipped to critique and understand multiple narratives and perspectives. But it was clear that many of those who have not, even if they were critical, they were unable to engage with those and felt unequipped. And including more role models, this was very clear, of people they can identify with. One student from Beni Suef, the southern province, was saying that how it was a highlight for her to hear about a young student and their role in the 1919 revolution, and some of the other political events in the country's history. And as soon as they heard about that someone from their own context could make a contribution, how empowering that was. And so less content and less emphasis, and I won't go on here because I know that there are various people who've written much more on that, and I see Mona nodding, and I know that Hania wrote a lot about that, and even some of the movements by Egyptian mothers, I think at some point having sit-ins or even taking to the scene saying, please, less memorization when it comes to ancient Egyptian queens and dates and the names of kings and all these long names that we have. Tell us more about the history, how people lived, how can we identify, what are their wisdom traditions, what are their philosophies, their epistemology that we can draw on, as opposed to just rote memorization. That came up a lot, and unfortunately triggered a lot of negative sentiments in amongst many. Some of them even used very powerful words as far as saying, I hate ancient Egyptian history simply because the way that they were taught in school, which is very unfortunate, of course, because that then negates that whole very rich history with all that it could contribute for this society moving forward and for humanity. Preparing teachers to critically engage with dominant discourses and with their own personalities, that was also clear in some of the insights from students. Some of the participants spoke about how, for instance, the curricula and textbooks could be extremely balanced when it came to depicting ancient Egyptian queens, for instance. But a lot of times, because of their own positionalities or their ideologies, some male teachers, for instance, mocked that, or maybe to make some jokes or make their students laugh, they would mock, for instance, ancient Egyptian queens. And it's interestingly enough, none of the male participants commented on that, but several of the female participants noted that. So helping teachers engage with their own positionalities and their ideologies, and perhaps how those shape the way they are the gatekeepers, of course, but also how they can help prepare students engage with dominant discourses and competing discourses, as we saw when students might be critical, but when they revert to other historical narratives, how can they perhaps be more critical in understanding the discourses that these narratives are embedded within, what interests these depictions and representations are serving, and so. And finally, I will end with the current engagement and next steps. I'm currently extremely privileged. It's been 4 years in the making now, engaging with a couple of questions that hopefully will coming out soon in a couple of edit volumes. But based on this research and the book, I've become more and more, I think, aware and interested in how do we move forward as a humanity and as an Egyptian society, overcoming growing polarization and so on. And how can we really find ways for respectful dialogue and constructive dialogue beyond silos and echo chambers that we unfortunately see all across, whether in Canada, the US, Egypt, and many other parts of the world. One key entry point, I believe, is trying to dismantle and trying to challenge some of the hierarchies that our curricula sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously create, whether it's about racial supremacy and or how do we depict ancient civilizations in a way that perhaps then represent the Western and Eurocentric perspectives as the epitome of human civilization vis-a-vis perhaps the Afro-Asiatic civilizations that are seen maybe in the linear fashion as more the primitive or backward, for instance, and so on. So the questions that are really drawing me now, based on that, on the book and moving forward, is how can more balanced representations, including critical engagement with historical and current injustice, help us better draw on ancient and indigenous wisdom, traditions, and ways of knowing and being, including, for instance, ancient would include pre-Abrahamic civilizations, wisdom traditions, such as ancient Egyptian, ancient Mesopotamian, ancient Greek, Roman, and so on. How can those allow for more inclusive and self-reflective curricula and classroom practice towards more respectful, constructive dialogue and overcoming polarization that we see in our globally and in our societies? Also, collaborating with several scholars as part of the World Education Research Association's International Research Network that is basically focusing on curricular representation, classroom practices. And finally, extremely grateful again for the support of our wonderful Professor Bill Pinar in allowing us also to publish a couple of the edited volumes that are trying to look at these questions in several contexts around the world. One will be focusing on African and Euro-Asian contexts, and the other on the context of the Americas. And so stay tuned, please. It should be coming out in, they say, I think August 2024 is the latest we heard from Routledge. But again, very grateful to be able to do that, and again, for the support of our great Bill Pinar. And I will stop here, and thank you very much again. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces, and I look forward to a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Ehab, for that engaging overview of your work. To follow up, we're going to begin with the video presentation, contribution from Dr. Zanazanian, and after that, we'll hear from Dr. Mitchell. So over to Paul.
Hello, Ehab. Thank you so much for inviting me to your book launch. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very honored that you asked me to write the foreword to your book. Your book is very interesting. It's really well written, and it's just a wonderful text that contributes a lot to our growing knowledge of how people interact with, especially in history education, how students interact with the official state narratives that they are faced with, and sometimes are even obliged to memorize or know by heart and are tested on through standardized testing. And that puts a lot of pressure, especially on young individuals for marginalized groups and communities who don't necessarily see a reflection of their own experiences and realities in the history curriculum. So it's a really interesting read. We learn a lot about Egypt and the context there, the socio-political context, and the recent demonstrations that have taken place in the country with the Arab Spring, and how that event and the memory of that event, that recent event, trickles down into the historical consciousness of the young students or young adults, rather, that you interview for your study. So it's really interesting. We learn a lot about how these individuals interact with the official state history, that in a way tells them that this is your history, this is what you should remember, while at the same time ignoring or silencing the minor differences in the lived experiences of these various communities or groups, where there is a lack of their own story, where they are the protagonist of their history, and contributions to the state, the nation they belong to. So what's really interesting, or one key point, there are a lot of wonderful key points that you raise in the book, but one key point that really stands out is this idea of a tension perhaps behind the idea of bringing in nuance to understanding the complexities of the past, versus the idea of transmitting the message or the key idea that needs to be understood, or that students need to understand in order to become citizens of the state and to practice their citizenry in a responsible and supportive manner of the nation, to maintain and regenerate the nation beyond, above and beyond their everyday lives in a way. So this tension between nuance and message, I think, is interesting, is something to reflect on. I've looked at it in terms of my own research and my own work, and I really find that your book contributes to that conversation, and especially when you talk about the critical dimension or tendency when looking at Roussen's framework, in terms of a repertory for reading the realities of their historical sense making, when faced with a master narrative that really excludes the experiences of marginalized or minority groups in Egypt. So how do these critical students react? Are they more interested in promoting a nuance, or are they more interested in bringing in their own message as a counter narrative that contradicts or disrupts what is presented to them? And how do they negotiate that tension ultimately? So I think it's an interesting contribution that your book offers, and I would love to hear more about that tension, or more about that critical approach to history, or that critical approach to the official state sanctioned narrative that they are obliged to learn and memorize by heart, and what is it that we can learn from their experiences. So thank you again once more. Wonderful book, amazing author, great ideas, and it was just a great experience to work with you. And I was honored to work with you and with your supervisor, Claudia Mitchell, on this wonderful project. So thank you again for inviting me. I'm so sorry that I'm not there in real time. I apologize, but I'm sure the event's gonna go really well and your book is gonna be a huge success. A big thank you to the organizers also. Thank you so much, and have a great book launch. Thanks. Bye-bye.
And over to you, Ahab.
Thank you very much, Kieran. Thanks again, Paul. I know he's not with us, but thanks for all his support, of course, and writing that wonderful forward, and also the questions and the insights now. I would maybe perhaps I would just say that I think the question is very important, and I think it merits further investigation in terms of how do critical approaches to history, or how the different approaches we saw in the historical consciousness shape one's understanding of the role as a citizen and their civic engagement and so on. So in reflecting on that, there are a couple of things I think that might help shed light on some of what Paul was raising here. One, I think, is as I highlighted earlier, that the nuance between and trying to introduce some more textured understanding of the critical type of historical consciousness that we sometimes and most of the times lump together as a monolithic block, and see as perhaps everybody included there are asking all the right questions about structural injustices or misrepresentations or this or that, as well, that they would have the reflective abilities to also critically self-reflect and be reflexive on their own positionality and the blind spots, which we see is not the case. So trying to maybe question and critique some of those assumptions so that we can be better equipped, whether in curricular the content or in enactment of some of the teachings of those, and in helping students develop the tools to be better equipped to understand their own personality and how those shape their understanding to various types of history, but including their religious identities, their cultural identity, their gender identity, socioeconomic, and all those other identity markers, of course. In terms of civic attitudes and what the shapes, in the book there was I've also trying to show a little bit of some of these connections. So you see, of course, these are based on, I had about 39 participants, so not claiming any generalizations or that, but as I alluded to earlier, for instance, it was clear that some minoritized students, and this was very refreshing, really, and very heartwarming and reassuring for someone like me who cares a lot about my beloved Egypt, and in many ways seeing students who felt left out, whether because of their gender, their religion, or and so on, that you could see that they were engaged in projects initiating maybe interfaith related dialogue related programs, such as going to hospitals and giving out gifts based on a church group, for instance, and making sure that they're not saying that they belong to this church or that church, for instance, that they're not taking credit for a particular group, but just spreading that charity and goodness and so on. I think it was even more obvious for those who were felt, because of their intersectionalities, that they were even excluded further, not only because of religious identity, for instance, but also because of gender. And I saw many of those engage in different ways in working with, for instance, children living on the streets and trying to promote well-being and so on, with the understanding that things like that would help in many ways create a better, more just society, and so on. Again, away from the confines of their own issues, but perhaps because of having lived and understood what it means to feel invisible or to feel like a minority, that empathy was coming out very clearly and translated into particular choices of engagement, in addition to some general engagements of doing maybe some charity and so on. But I saw that specifically with students who felt excluded, or their narratives feeling excluded, that many of them, not all, of course, some of them perhaps were more cynical about that and not choosing to contribute, but many of them chose to be more be more proactive about reaching out to the other and trying to improve things and trying to maybe show up so that to help the other who doesn't know much about them to overcome some of the stereotypes or the prejudices they might have against them because being a woman or being of a religious minority and so on. So that's one thing. The other thing I will end with saying is that because of that turning point that I spoke about in terms of the official narrative and so on, there seems to also have been a shift in overall the attitude vis-a-vis civic engagement, especially those who are critical, of course, not the traditional ones, perhaps have continued to engage in very nationalistic, perhaps political parties or movements and so on, with continuing with that understanding of taking that history as is and not challenging it. Those with more critical attitudes or whether reflective or unreflective, I saw a very interesting also intentionality behind. Some of them were starting to engage in organizations perhaps that were very much under the radar, that were helping communities, but were not perhaps in a place to be used as propaganda for particular institutions or to give legitimacy to particular maybe elites and so on. So a lot of that a critical understanding of these turning points, I think, helped shape a better awareness and more selectivity in where they were going to put their effort and their energy, in an awareness maybe also and that it won't be misused or abused in ways that would perhaps inadvertently or reproduce particular maybe hierarchies of particular elites or maybe legitimizing particular institutions versus others. So I hope this sheds some light on both questions.
Thank you, Ehab. And we're coming up to the hour here, so let's move directly over to Dr. Mitchell. And if you give me the nod, I'll be able to share my screen as you have asked. And perhaps Dr. Mitchell is unable to join us. So she asked me to share this screen with you all, and I'll read that aloud. And then perhaps Ehab can address this. Dr. Mitchell shares, I drew 2 lines here to show that there is always more than one version of the story. And in between the 2 lines, I included some symbols to show the diversity of the country. History follows 2 lines always, one of goodness and one of evil. For instance, during the January 2011 revolution events, even though people were dying, there was a sense of utopia. Muslims supported Christians as they were praying and so on. And within those 2 lines, where gray signifies corruption and blue signifies optimism, between them we see several symbols. In every moment there is everything, lots of good or bad things. So I think I'll just highlight on the image there, and perhaps Ehab might address that quote.
Thank you very much, Kieran. I have it.
Sorry, Ehab.
Yes, please. Yes, dear.
Okay. For some reason, I'm just having problems unmuting and there I am. No, I'm gone again.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Sorry. We're just having a little bit of a chaos. And I apologize for being late. There's a big fire on Sherbrooke Street, so getting here was a bit wild. So the quote has now been read, and it was right out of chapter 3. And so I just wanted to say maybe I can repeat it, and I apologize again. Just to say congratulations on your launch. Congratulations on the book, and I think that your thesis project, along with a couple of your colleagues, I believe Casey Burkholder at the same time, really took on this idea of history teaching and the visual. But I think it's really set alight a great deal of interest in visual methodologies. And of course, I'm prejudiced in relation to history teaching. And even as we speak right now, there is one of your contemporaries or following you is Isidore Shamji from Cameroon, who's having history teachers in Cameroon draw Anglophone and Francophone perspectives there, drawing on your methodology or using your methodology. So just to say that I think it really set off a lot of interest in how history teaching can really be, I guess, brought the idea of picturing history as being a really critical framework for studying history. And so the quote that that Forde just read out from Fatima, and I was very happy to see that you didn't use that quote earlier, because I was thinking, oh my goodness, if he uses that one, there goes my question. But Fatima's question about the two lines, or at least two lines of history, and the picture that she drew of the they look like ribbons, kind of going forward side by side, but not intersecting. I think, and how she talks about evil, good and evil, and how there's good everywhere and there's evil everywhere. And I think it really talks to me about, questions about the responsibility of teachers, of course, and history teachers in relation to how we represent or how we think about being sort of, I guess, kind of helping young people to navigate those spaces. So I guess I would really love to hear you talk, first of all, in relation to Fatima's quote about the two lines of history and the good and the evil, and how you think history teaching and historians responsibly take up history. And then I guess my second question is really, have you used drawing in any other way? And would you think about having history teachers draw history teachers? So two-part question. And again, my apologies for the techno chaos and fires, and Montreal is burning. Okay, thank you.
We're not spreading fake news here.
No fake news. Okay,
No,
Montreal is burning. It's on fire.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudia. It's so lovely to see your face. I was worried that maybe there were some technical issues. It's so great and you could see all the big smiles that, of course, as soon as you came on the screen from various parts of the world, from Egypt, from Montreal, and from elsewhere. So lovely too. Thank you so much for your questions. And so I will start by answering your final question, maybe, and then I'll go into so first, we just had a workshop June 15th with several people here from the school board in Kitchener-Waterloo, and of course, they have been drawing their understanding of ancient and indigenous histories. And this is yet, of course, to be analyzed. And I'm running very, but just to answer your question, what this is basically, these are teachers and school board and curriculum developers and trying to engage with some of these questions and hopefully make sense of this all. And this will hopefully be my presentation in the upcoming Congress will be around some of those and your wonderful, inspiring methodology, of course. So to answer your question, thank you so much for bringing up Fatima. Fatima is a very, very inspiring case in point, really. She grew up in a very small village outside of the outskirts of Giza, in a very conservative family background, the first to be educated in her family to go to university. And she exhibited through her university being on scholarships and so on. She got to take some history courses. She got to be engaged in some extracurricular programs. Some of our wonderful, for instance, friends such as Alia Musallam, احكي يا تاريخ, or Tell Us, O History, and so on, which helped her reflect in different ways. So Fatima, for me, in the typology that I showed, she refused to draw one line. When I said most of the others, they would draw a line and say, okay, and the King Menes brought the two countries together, the two parts of Egypt, and then we were unified. And all the key milestones that everybody knew, that all of people on the screen would know, who grew up in Egypt. She refused to do that, and she did draw the two lines. She said, who am I to say that there's ever one narrative? And then she started to critically reflect on her own positionality, growing up in a very conservative place, and how she understood history before, but then now how she understands it based on living the experience of the events of 2011 and subsequently, but also being exposed to some of these extracurricular um, historical engagement and historical research tools. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think it's Fatima's case shows the importance of creating opportunities in the classroom and in curricula to help students, as I was maybe mentioning earlier in a couple of the slides, the idea that we need to be a bit more forthcoming in helping students understand that their worldviews and ours and everybody's will always be limited by our positionality, and maybe that trying to overcome some of that self-righteousness that especially that might be embedded in some of the narratives that we can't really touch when it comes to scripture or when it comes to religious, which are extremely sensitive areas for all of us, but maybe more so Egyptians who really hold religion very close to their hearts, or many of them, whether Muslim or Christian or otherwise. Yeah. So helping, I think, creating these spaces for critical reflection would be helpful in that sense, whether on their own positionalities and how those might be bringing some limitations in their understanding of history and power dynamics and so on, but also in the various dominant and competing discourses, especially when it comes to the fact that some people like Fatima, for instance, I think through her, and since she started to actually pinpoint some of the discourses that she took for granted, for instance, the religious-based discourse that she grew up with in her very conservative family, that was her understanding of the world and of the other, of maybe non-Muslims or people from other socioeconomic backgrounds or other genders and so on. Through that, I think process, she's come to that I think a space where she's able to be critical, but also move beyond being critical, which I think is also remains somehow needs to be problematized, because a lot of times there's critique and deconstruction, but then how do we move beyond that to create a narrative? And in this case, I think Fatima, and that's why I chose to highlight her drawing here in the book, it's one of the ones that takes a lot of space in unpacking and so on, is that she, I think, embodies in many ways the idea that there also is a need for us to move beyond that maybe us versus them approach of that maybe critical approaches hold, or maybe even critical pedagogy might and critical theory propagates. It's us versus them. It's the haves versus the have-nots. It's how do we create also narratives that include and that also help see potential allies on various parts, on various camps, and how can we move forward together as a society and as a humanity through dialogue and through understanding various perspectives and appreciating maybe some of what each perspective might offer, as opposed to negating and sticking to one, replacing one exclusionary narrative with another. I think that's maybe what Fatma was offering us, really, and in a very inspiring way. And I think looking back at her journey, there could be some entry points where we can maybe introduce some of those experiences in classrooms and curricula as well, to help others develop that ability to understand and approach narratives from more critical as well as multi-perspectival approaches. Yeah. Thank you, Claudia, and I hope I answered some of your...
Oh yeah, thank you very much. And again, congratulations on the launch of this book, and exciting with all your new publications as well. And we look forward to your stardom at CSSE in a couple of months too. So thank you very much.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you so much, Claudia.
Thank you. Thank you, Ehaab, for sharing your work with us today. And thank you to our panelists, Claudia Mitchell and Paul Zanazanian. The recording will be posted later on YouTube. The link is in the chat there if you care to click on it before the meeting closes. And thank you also to our guests for joining us today. We hope to see you next time. All the best. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Kieran. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Take care. Thank you.